Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Melinda Nusafora. When US President Donald Trump pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal in May, the fate of billions of dollars worth of business dealings was thrown into disarray. The United States has reimposed sanctions on Iran, which forbids any US company or subsidiary from trading with the country. It also threatens to penalise international companies if they do business with the oil-rich nation. Iran is already starting to feel the economic squeeze and has warned it may follow America's lead and withdraw from the nuclear peace process. In an effort to salvage the agreement and secure lucrative business dealings, the European Union has come up with a plan to circumvent the standoff. The EU says it will create a new financial mechanism to allow countries to continue trading with Iran without breaching US sanctions. It's referred to as a special purpose vehicle and could act as a middleman or buffer between the companies and Tehran. To discuss this further, joining us from our Ankara studio is Bozkurt Aran, a former Turkish ambassador to Iran, and Borzu Dargahi, who is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Borzu, we're going to start with you. There are no details yet exactly what this plan is going to be, but if it was to eventuate, how would you see this working? Can you give us an example of how this could be achieved to circumvent the US sanctions?
Well, I mean, one of the ideas under discussion by the diplomats from the EU, China, and Russia is to have Iran essentially transfer its crude oil to Russia. Russia would then refine those petroleum products, give them to Europe, and then Europe would transfer goods in exchange for those petroleum products to Iran. So essentially setting up a kind of barter system.
It sounds like a bit of a complex situation. I'm going to bring you in now here, Bozkurt. You're sceptical about this. You say that this can't work. Why?
And totally negative is not possible, of course, because we don't know the details of the transaction, how they are going to set up this legal system. And it's going to be something quite serious, of course. I mean, it will be, they have to work out the details. It's going to be a legal new scheme of transactions between the banks. Today, the existing one, the SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide, whatever it is so difficult. It is controlled totally by the United States. And the United States is not totally prohibits the Iranian banks to have any kind of transactions within the system. So the EU is trying to set up a new system. And we don't know exactly how this is going to work. I totally agree with our colleague who says there's going to be a barter system. It's going to be a barter system, but it will take some time to really know the details of the system.
Even though this is still in its early stages, we don't have the details yet, what we're seeing, even from this proposal, is that the US is really isolating itself from so many other countries that were staunch allies and trade partners. Bozkurt, can you tell me when we have seen another time when the US has really isolated itself like this? Is this unprecedented?
If you ask the question to me, of course it is unprecedented. I mean, but if you listen, or if you carefully study the speech of President Trump at the United Nations, it makes it very clear. And we say that we are rejecting the globalization and we are embracing patriotism. And even though the U.S. is the main culprit, I should say, that established today's architecture of the world order, still they are the ones who are opposing it now. And he's not very happy with the WTO. He's not very happy with the IMF. He's not very happy with the World Bank. And in the United Nations, he's totally neglecting it altogether. And he hopes that U.S. will be isolated
However this mechanism is set up, whether it works, whether it doesn't work, is this really just a very important political statement? Is this a symbolic shift, a mood and a move away from dominance of the US dollar as far as international trade goes?
I don't know about dominance of the US dollar, but I think it is important to take a step back beyond the logistics of this particular mechanism, however it may pan out. There is this question. There is this. I spoke to one diplomat who is actually in New York involved in these talks. And he was saying to me, the important thing is not what the mechanism is going to be. The important thing is the fact that the EU, Russia, and China are making these plans without the US, making these huge major decisions. And I think that goes for a number of issues in the region. For example, you have Syria, Turkey, and you have Russia, Turkey, and Iran talking about Syria without the US. You recently had Turkey, Russia, Germany, and France talking about Syria without the US, not even bothering to put them in the loop at this point. And I think that just speaks to the isolation of the U.S. What Trump is doing, I'm not sure if it's based in any ideology. I think he's just probably has a very weak and kind of dysfunctional administration from everything that I've seen. And, various wacky ideas are getting in there. This sort of weird version of anti-globalism. Like they don't want globalism. Meanwhile, they're involved and interfering in every single country in the Middle East.
It's changing the outlook, isn't it?
I don't think there's anything consistent there. I don't think there's any thinking there. I think it's just various. And I even think that the anti-Iran stance, the harsh anti-Iran stance, is more about satisfying a very narrow domestic U.S. constituency in Washington, the think tanks, the bankrollers of the Republican Party, more than based in any kind of ideology. As Trump himself said, I think this Rouhani is a very fine man. I wouldn't mind meeting him,
The rest of the world, though, we're looking at here now, the EU aren't following America's lead. Could this be viewed as just the EU trying to mark time until we see what happens in the midterm elections? Is this a shallow attempt to appease Iran so that they don't walk away from the nuclear deal and they are happy to continue trading with other Western countries?
Maybe I should say a few words about the American system. The United States has created a political architecture that solely relies on coalitions. America was the country that built the coalitions around the world. It was United Nations, of course, the NATO, the relations with transatlantic relations, and the relations with Europe. Those were the important pillars of the whole thing. And of course, the NAFTA on the other side of the Atlantic. Now, America wishes that these coalitions is not serving the needs of the American people. So they are isolating, as my colleague has just said, isolating themselves from the coalitions, and they are putting an end to the coalitions. And at the same time, but the whole system relies on American, powerful economy. Now, as we go back, as we try to establish a new SWIFT system, that will be a competition, or maybe the competition is a harsh word, but the gap between the United States and Europe is widening. And that's quite important, of course. And to see that this coming is quite difficult. And on the Iranian case, of course, the nuclear deal and so forth. Nuclear deal was established or signed in 2015. 3 years was quite important for all of us. But then all of a sudden, United States decided that this deal is not working for themselves in Middle East. And they think that, and the U.S. thinks that the Iranian ambitions in the Middle East is totally opposing the American interests there. And of course, secondly, I mean, on another pillar is the missile, the ballistic missiles. There is no article in the deal that prohibits the ballistic missiles experimentations.
All right, I am going to interrupt you there and just put our final question now to you, Bozu. The United States has in the past penalised companies significantly for breaching US sanctions. Do you think that companies in the European Union will be willing to use this new mechanism? Is it too risky?
I think that there's a couple things. One, the effect of the sanctions, the effect of the U.S. Kind of warning these companies not to do business with the Islamic Republic has already taken hold. So I think a lot of these companies, for example, if you're a big company, you go to your shareholders, CEO, say, we want to do business with Iran, there's going to be reputational and other risks. And, you know, as a big publicly held company, you're going to have a hard time selling the company on a decision to do business with Iran. But I think that there's going to be small and medium-sized enterprises that don't have a lot of U.S. investment, that don't have a lot of stake in what the U.S. thinks of them. They will be more than willing to use this mechanism. But when it comes to, for example, huge European companies, pharmaceuticals, manufacturing, and so on, they're going to be very reluctant. But they've already, I mean, in a way, the effect of the sanctions is already in place because they've already stepped back.
It's going to be very interesting to see how it all plays out. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us here on Straight Talk. After years of animosity and setbacks, Turkey and several European countries have started to show a willingness to mend ties. The heated rhetoric of the past year has largely been toned down as both sides search for common ground in areas such as trade, the war in Syria and fighting terrorism. Omer Kablan looks at how a changing global landscape and the role of the US may have helped bridge that gap of mistrust between Turkey and Europe.
It's a relationship that has deteriorated over the past few years, but Turkey and Europe's increasing common interests have helped bridge the often troubled divide. And the European Union is confident that Turkey's ongoing row with the US will bring it even closer to Brussels. Both are eager to fight against what they call Donald Trump's economic aggression.
Daha çok üreteceğiz. Daha çok ihraç edeceğiz. Depoları kilitlemenin anlamı yok. İhraç, ihraç, ihraç.
And as Europe looks to Turkey for help with migration and the war in Syria, the two are rediscovering their common ground. Turkey's president also said a Syrian government offensive in Idlib would cause humanitarian and security risks for Turkey, Europe and beyond. And Europe agrees. EU governments have agreed to provide around $3.5 billion in aid to Turkey to control the flow of refugees. And in June, they promised another $3.5 billion to be paid in 2019 and 2020. In an opinion piece published in the New York Times in August, the Turkish president warned that Turkey has alternatives to the US. Analysts widely read his comments as implying a turn towards China, Russia or Qatar, but they may also have been directed at Europe. Turkey and some European countries have already begun mending ties. Turkey and the Netherlands have reinstated their ambassadors. Relations between the two countries were strained after Dutch authorities banned Turkish politicians from addressing the Turkish community as part of a referendum campaign. A Turkish court has also released 2 Greek soldiers who were in prison suspected of espionage. The decision was welcomed by the European Union. The latest improvement in relations prompted European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker to make some of the warmest remarks about the Turkish government in months. He said, "Turkey has nothing to fear from its European neighbours. We want to see a democratic, stable and prosperous Turkey." Ankara's relationship with Europe had hit new lows in 2016 after a coup attempt, with European leaders expressing concern about the state of emergency that followed. This new phase of closer neighborly discourse is largely driven by Germany. It seems the two countries may now leave their problems behind and look ahead.
Turkey and Germany will improve their economic, political, and strategic relationship. And with a similar outlook on solving regional problems, I believe our mutual goals will herald a new chapter in Turkish-German relations.
Multiple signs show that Turkey and Europe are forging a closer relationship for mutual economic growth and are reaching a common understanding on the war in Syria. But could the catalyst for all this be their common stance against US foreign policy? Ömer Kablan, Straight Talk.
To discuss this issue further, I'm now joined by Markus Lefocht, who is the president of the German-Turkish Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and Hakan Akbaş, who is a senior advisor at the Albright Stonebridge Group. All right, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us on Straight Talk.
Thanks for having us.
Hakan, I'm going to start with you. Do you think the erratic behaviour we've seen from the United States with regards to sanctions, trade, is that pushing Turkey and the EU closer together?
Mr. Donald Trump becoming the US president obviously created a new world order. And from G20 summits to NATO summits, and as we've seen the other day at the United Nations Grand Assembly meetings, the speech that Mr. Trump gave, obviously the world is facing the real politic of Mr. Trump, which inevitably is creating anti-coalitions vis-a-vis, for example, trade and economy-wise. Obviously, Turkey is getting closer to EU. And also we've seen this on the military and security front, especially in Syria.
Do you think Turkey and the EU would have gotten closer if it wasn't for Donald Trump?
Well, we know that Turkey's accession journey has been put on full stop. And last year, parties got together to basically discuss this migrant deal in return for Turkey getting the long overdue visa-free travel rights. And it's been a difficult sort of relationship, I would say, and it's unfortunate that the journey has come to a full stop. But you know, as I said, the real politic of Mr. Trump, I think, is forcing both Turkey and EU to basically finally walk the talk. And I think that from Turkey's perspective, what Turkey has achieved in Idlib, in Syria, will basically, and again, Turkey worked with both EU and US in a way, so that Mr. Putin would put a stop onto its offensive, which was a big achievement for Turkish diplomacy.
It is. I'm going to ask you about Idlib in a couple of minutes' time, but before we drill down onto the situation in Syria, I just want to put a question to you first of all, Markus, with regards to the relationship between Turkey and Germany. We saw that deteriorate after the 2016 failed coup attempt. Things weren't good last year, but they've turned it around, and we've seen Germany come out in defence of Turkey during the recent slide in the Turkish currency, the lira. Why? Why do you think Germany was so vocal in its support of Turkey?
There are several reasons for this. First of all, the overall relationship between Germany and Turkey is a very, very solid one, dating back in particular on the diplomatic and economic front for more than 200 years. Germany is Turkey's largest trade partner, with trade just in 2017 of 30.8 billion euros. And this is a very intense relationship that is also very much affecting both sides in terms of industrial production. Turkey is an important part of the supply chain for German companies. And Germany is very interested also from its own point of view and due to its own role in the refugee relationship and issues, that Turkey is playing its role in this region, that Turkey is a stable factor, a stabilizing anchor in this region, and therefore the German interest in this area, in this part of the world, is very much related to Turkey.
We've seen ambassadors, the Turkish and ambassadors for the Netherlands reinstated, which has been an important political move, but do you also see it as an important sort of symbolic move for other EU countries to change their attitude of Turkey and to really get these close ties with the EU as a whole?
Yes, I believe we reached now, after a very difficult year of 2017, we reached a level where we have stopped talking about each other and now we are talking with each other and ensuring that the communication channels are reopened again, and that also, of course, and Hakan already mentioned that very clearly, that the EU accession topic was always a difficult one, but that now there is again at least a chance to start the communication on that subject again.
Hakan, I'm going to now revisit what you were talking about with regards to the war in Syria and the deal we saw struck with regards to Idlib. It seems as if the European Union is very comfortable letting Turkey take the lead on this issue, and they are playing a very important diplomatic role in trying to strike a peace deal in Syria. How important do you think that has been to change the EU's opinion of Turkey, and how is the EU viewing Turkey now with regards to these diplomatic negotiations?
I think that very issue in Idlib definitely was a wake-up call for EU in terms of realizing how critical it is to have a financially and security-wise stable Turkey in their southern border. And also, I think EU also realized that if we were to have another crisis in Idlib, they could see more than 3 million, again, refugees knocking on their door, as we've seen. And it's been a major tragedy, people just drowning in the Aegean Sea, in the Mediterranean Sea. And I think that it's everybody's job to really prevent another major human, basically, catastrophe. And, but having said that, obviously, this is a socially and politically also challenge, a major challenge and priority for all the European basically governments. And so Turkey, I think, will be an anchor from that perspective. On top of it, obviously, Turkey has long been sort of trying to negotiate an expanded customs union, which is very important. But the other pieces, before we get to that, as Russia becoming more aggressive on not only on the southern border, but also on the eastern border, I think EU is also realizing how important as an asset to have NATO's second largest and strongest military basically members and being in good terms with Turkey. So I think Syria will continue to be a major problem for everybody, and I think that EU will realize that they need to be also in very good terms with Turkey.
Yes, and Turkey is playing such an important role on everyone's behalf there. Before we wrap it up, Marcus, I just want to ask one final question to you. If the EU and Turkey are going to get even closer, what needs to change? What do you think are the biggest hurdles, the biggest roadblocks to even closer relationships?
We have all that outlined in the accession and progress reports that the European Union is publishing on a regular basis. Definitely one topic when I'm talking about industry and trade is the customs union. The customs union is something that has put on hold and has, by its current nature, even deficiencies in comparison to the initial intention of the customs union of 1995. Because both sides, the European side and the Turkish side, have put in so-called non-tariff barriers for goods coming from both sides. And it is necessary even before we start talking about a potential 2.0 version of the customs union, to eliminate these tariffs, these non-tariff barriers, and to make sure that the trade is flowing according to the initial intentions. Then we can talk about further progress in the customs union, and that is what the industry and business primarily is concerned about. And then there are definitely many other political matters.
What are the political matters, apart from the customs union?
Including solving this Cyprus issue, and also ensuring, but that I consider even a non-tariff barrier, is visa-free travel from a Turkish point of view. These are things that have to be removed and I believe require an immediate solution.
It's going to be interesting weeks and months ahead as we see Turkey and the European Union getting even closer. It's going to be one to watch. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us here on Straight Talk.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
That's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Melinda Nusofora. If you've got any comments or suggestions, do share them with us on Twitter with #StraightTalk. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until next time, take care and goodbye.